Now here we're looking at the chapter 11 on intuitive knowledge. I think a very reasonable question at this point would be why Russell bothers to introduce a new category of knowledge, this so-called intuitive knowledge, when it seems that one of the earlier categories that he's introduced towards the beginning of the book, knowledge by acquaintance, would seem to fill that role. That is, we're introduced to this distinction between things we know immediately or directly or by acquaintance and things that we know indirectly, mediately, or by description. So why would he introduce this additional category, intuitive knowledge? Well, actually looking at the very beginning of chapter 12, Truth and Falsehood, may give us some notion. He says, our knowledge of truth, unlike our knowledge of things, has an opposite, namely error. That might give us some help here in understanding what Russell is up to. My knowledge by acquaintance, if there is such a thing, is knowledge of things, not knowledge of truth. That is, some things I am acquainted with directly, and those would be, again, going by what Russell said, sense data and certain universals. And this is knowledge of things, and we have to think of sense data as things, which is a little bit odd, but certainly I think Russell's committed to that. So I can be acquainted with things, or I can know things indirectly through description. But what do I intuit, or of what do I have intuitive knowledge? Russell says something in passing on page 112 that might help. He says that we have intuitive knowledge we have certain intuitive knowledge, and he says towards the bottom, you don't have page numbers, I'm sorry. He says in this chapter, it would seem also, though this is more disputable, that there are some self-evident ethical principles, such as, quote, we ought to pursue what is good. So Russell is suggesting that there is an ethical principle, we ought to pursue what is good, and that perhaps we know it intuitively, that is, we know it without any further proof, or that it's self-evident. But if you look at that proposition, which is an imperative, really, we ought to pursue what is good. Of what in that proposition do we have acquaintance? Well, it would seem that all of the universals that are used in that sentence, in that proposition, ought, we, pursue, is, and good are all universals that Russell would, of course, say that we know, I would say, by acquaintance. That is, we are acquainted with the concept of the good. We are acquainted with the concept of ought. We are acquainted with the concept is and pursue, and those are things, those universals. And remember, Russell's committed to the idea that universals have being that is distinct from our thinking about them. That is, they have independent being. We are familiar with them all. We are acquainted with them all. But here we have a proposition, that is, we ought to pursue what is good. So we see that a proposition has been built up out of universals with which we are acquainted. That is, we know those universals. But a proposition, which is a judgment, you might say, a judgment, a proposition is made up of universals here, those concepts with which we are familiar, and one might say familiar directly through acquaintance. But these concepts have been put together with a certain logical structure to form a proposition. That is, a judgment has been made, and that judgment may be true or false. That is, it could be true that we ought to pursue what is good. It could be false. That is, it's at least conceivable. We could say, it is not true that we ought to pursue what is good, or we ought not pursue what is good. Now, that may turn out to be something that we would reject on certain grounds, but it is at least conceivable to say that is, we have formed a proposition, made a judgment using those concepts with which we are familiar, and that judgment could be true or false. Now, our knowledge of the concepts themselves is of a quite different nature. That is, say that I know the good. I have acquaintance with the concept good. That is, I know a thing, and there is no opposite, is what he's getting at in the first sentence of chapter 12. Our knowledge of truths, unlike our knowledge of things, has an opposite, namely error. So my knowledge of things has no opposite, and I may know something directly, be acquainted with it, have direct knowledge of it. But it wouldn't really make any sense to say, well, I know that that thing is true and not false. Only propositions or judgments, that is, statements made with concepts, can be true or false. And what Russell seems to be introducing here, terminologically, is this word intuition or intuitive, to signify that there are some truths, some propositions, as opposed to things. That is, these would be statements about things, statements that make judgments about things, that we know intuitively. That is, that we know what you might, I don't know, the terminology would fit here, know directly. But the really key thing is that there are some judgments, propositions, and some truths that we can be sure of without further proof. That is, there are some truths about things, some propositions about things, which are immediately evident, or what he calls self-evident. So I hope that does something to clear up, maybe not what Russell was talking about, but why he's